before notifications, before emails, before phones that never stopped buzzing. There was a sound people waited for, footsteps on the road, the soft clink of a mailbox opening, the quiet promise that something from far away had finally arrived. A letter, it might carry love, it might carry bad news, it might carry nothing important at all, but it mattered because someone, somewhere, had taken time to write it. For generations, this was how the world stayed connected, not instantly, not effortlessly, but meaningfully. People waited days, sometimes weeks, just to hear from someone they missed, and that waiting gave words weight. It made sentences careful. It made feelings honest. The Postal Service was never just about mail. It was about trust. Trust that a message would survive distance. Trust that strangers would protect what mattered to you. A farmer in a remote village could write to his son across the ocean. A mother could stay connected to a daughter she might never see again. Ideas could travel quietly, one envelope at a time, until they became movements that changed history. This system helped build societies. It helped create democracy. It helped ordinary people organize, resist, and hope. But every system that connects also watches. Every letter had an address. Every address had a record. And in times of fear, governments learned they could read what people thought simply by opening their mail. Freedom and surveillance grew together, quietly, invisibly. Then, without a clear ending, the letters began to disappear. Phone calls replaced handwriting. Emails replaced envelopes. Packages replaced words. The mail kept coming, but it no longer carried hearts. It carried bills, advertisements. Things we bought, not things we felt. The post office stopped being a meeting place. Postal workers became invisible. Grand buildings turned into forgotten spaces. And still, the mail arrived through wars, through depressions, through pandemics. While the world shut down, postal workers kept walking their routes, delivering medicine, delivering food, delivering proof that physical connection still mattered. Because no matter how digital life becomes, human beings still live in bodies. They still need real things moved through real space by real people. This is not just the history of the Postal Service. It is the story of how we learn to connect, how we learn to control, and how, somewhere along the way, we traded patience for speed. This is a story about letters and what we lost when we stopped writing them. And once you see it, you will never hear the sound of mail arriving the same way again. In the beginning, there was only distance. Before the world became small, before satellites traced invisible lines across the sky, before fiber optics carried thought at the speed of light, there was the unbridgeable gap between human souls. A letter took months to cross an ocean. A message might never arrive. The space between cities was not measured in hours, but in the endurance of horses, the mercy of weather, and the faith that someone, somewhere, would carry your words into the unknown. This is not a story about progress. Not exactly. It is a story about the relentless human need to reach across the void, to touch another mind, to say, I am here. Are you there? The Postal Service, the very idea of it, is older than nations, older than flags. It existed before the borders we now take as immutable truths were even drawn. In the movements of messengers, in the hoofbeats that echoed through mountain passes and across endless plains, we see something fundamental about what it means to be human. We see the need to be known, to be remembered, to matter beyond the moment of our breath. But there is something else here, something darker and more mysterious. In the history of the Postal Service, we find the shadow history of power itself, of who controls the flow of information, who decides what truth travels and what truth dies in silence. We find empires rising and falling based on their ability to know what happens at their edges. We find secrets that must move faster than armies, and lies that must arrive before the truth can catch them. The Postal Service is not merely about letters. It is about control. It is about the architecture of human civilization itself. And it begins, as so many things do, with horses. The first messengers were not civil servants. They were not employees of any state. They were warriors, slaves, and desperate men running through darkness with news that could topple kingdoms. In ancient Persia, around 550 BCE, Cyrus the Great understood something that many rulers before him had not. An empire is only as strong as its ability to know what is happening within its own borders. The Achaemenid Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, encompassing territories so vast that a man could walk for months and never leave Persian lands. But vastness is both power and vulnerability. A rebellion in one province might not reach the capital until it had already succeeded. An invading army might cross half the empire before the emperor even knew war had begun. Cyrus solved this problem with an innovation so simple it seems almost inevitable in retrospect, yet it changed the very nature of governance. He created the Angariae, a system of mounted couriers stationed at intervals along the empire's roads. These were not ordinary messengers, they were selected for their endurance, their loyalty, and their willingness to die for the message they carried. Herodotus, the Greek historian who chronicled the ancient world with a mixture of careful observation and breathless wonder, wrote of these Persian messengers with something approaching awe. He described them as men who would not stop for snow, rain, heat, or darkness. Nothing, he insisted, prevented them from completing their appointed rounds. These words, though written 2,500 years ago about messengers in a fallen empire, would eventually be carved into the facade of the James A. Farley Post Office in New York City. The irony is rich, an American institution borrowing its motto from the very empire it might have once called barbaric. But perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps the Postal Service, in all its forms, has always been a borrowing from the past, a recognition that despite our technologies, despite our certainties, we are still doing what the Persians did, trying to bridge the unbridgeable. The Persian system was elegant in its brutality. Messengers would ride at full gallop from one station to the next, a distance of approximately 15 miles. There, a fresh rider on a fresh horse would take the message and continue. The original rider would rest, eat, tend his wounds, and wait for the next message heading in the opposite direction. In this way, messages could travel over 1,000 miles in a week, a speed that would not be matched in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. But speed came at a cost measured in flesh and bone. Horses died beneath these riders. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies broken by the relentless pace, and sometimes, in the mountain passes where bandits waited, or in the desert wastes where no help could come, the message simply vanished. The rider would be found weeks later, if at all, his body picked clean by vultures, the sealed cylinder that held the message cracked open and empty. What was in those messages? What words were worth such sacrifice? Most, we can assume, were mundane tax records, census data, administrative orders. The grinding machinery of empire requires constant feeding with information. But some were different. Some contained the kinds of secrets that reshape the world, orders for assassination, declarations of war, betrayals that would echo through generations. The Persian system was not motivated by any humanitarian desire to connect people. It was a tool of power, a way for the emperor to extend his will across distances that should have made governance impossible. When Darius I succeeded Cyrus, he expanded the network, creating the Royal Road, a highway stretching from Susa to Sardis, over 1,500 miles of maintained path cutting through mountains and across rivers. Along this road, the messengers rode with the authority of the emperor himself. To delay them was death. To interfere with them was to challenge the empire. This is the first lesson in the history of the postal service. It is never only about the letters. The Romans, as they did with so much they encountered, took the Persian system and made it their own. The cursus publicus, established by Augustus Caesar around 14 BCE, was perhaps the most sophisticated communication network the ancient world had ever seen. It was also, like its Persian predecessor, primarily a tool of military and administrative control. The Roman postal system was not available to ordinary citizens. It existed to serve the empire, to keep legions coordinated, governors informed, and potential rebellions detected before they could spread. The roads the messengers travelled were themselves statements of power, straight as spear thrusts through conquered territories, paved with stones that would last millennia. Even today, 2,000 years after the last Roman messenger rode them, many of these roads remain, buried under modern asphalt or running through forests that have reclaimed the land. Roman messengers travelled in vehicles called cisium, light two-wheeled carts pulled by horses. For truly urgent messages, riders would go on horseback, changing mounts at stations called mutations placed every 12 to 15 miles. A relay of fresh horses and riders could cover over 50 miles in a day, sometimes more if the message warranted it. But what is most striking about the Roman system is not its efficiency, impressive though it was, but its eventual collapse. As the empire fractured, as roads fell into disrepair and stations were abandoned, as the Pax Romana gave way to invasion and civil war, the postal system died with it. By the 5th century CE, the network that had once connected Britain to Mesopotamia had largely ceased to function. And with its death, something else died, the assumption that information could move reliably across distance. Europe entered what some call the Dark Ages, though perhaps that term is less about the absence of learning and more about the absence of communication. Without a functioning postal system, without the ability to share knowledge quickly across regions, each village, each monastery, each small kingdom became an island. News that might have once travelled in days now took months or years, if it travelled at all. Consider what this means. Imagine a world where you cannot know what is happening beyond your immediate horizon, where a plague sweeping through cities 100 miles away is only rumour, where a war might be raging in the next kingdom and you would not learn of it until refugees appeared at your gates. This is not merely inconvenience. This is a fundamental change in the nature of reality. Without communication, there is no shared truth. There is only the local, the immediate, the uncertain. The medieval period saw various attempts to rebuild postal systems, but these were fragmentary, incomplete. Monasteries maintained networks of messengers who carried letters between religious houses. Kings and nobles employed couriers, but these served individual interests, not any common good. The closest thing to a universal system were the merchants, those brave or desperate enough to travel the dangerous roads between cities, carrying not only goods but also letters, gossip, news. It is worth pausing here to consider the merchant messengers, because in many ways they represent something the official systems never could, the postal service as a human endeavour rather than a tool of power. These men, and occasionally women, though history has mostly erased their names, travelled without armies to protect them, without state authority to command safe passage. They relied on luck, cunning, and the universal language of commerce. They carried letters wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in their boots or sewn into the linings of their coats. Sometimes these were love letters, written in secret by noble ladies to forbidden suitors. Sometimes they were business contracts, the tedious details of wool prices and shipping schedules. Sometimes they were warnings, armies approaching, bandits on the road ahead, plague in the southern cities. The merchants asked for no grand recognition. They charged a few coins, calculated by weight and distance, and if they died on the road, well, such was the risk of the profession. Yet in their anonymous work, in their willingness to carry the words of strangers across dangerous lands, they kept alive the idea that distance could be overcome, that the human voice could reach farther than the human body. This is perhaps the secret heart of the postal service, the thing that makes it more than just logistics and efficiency. It is the promise that you are not alone, that your thoughts can escape the prison of your skull and touch another mind. That distance, which seems so final, is only a temporary obstacle. But promises require infrastructure, and in medieval Europe, infrastructure was collapsing. The roads the Romans built were still there, but they were slowly disappearing under vegetation. their paving stones stolen for local construction. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Bandits made travel deadly. The very concept of maintained public highways, roads that belonged to everyone and therefore to no one, had become foreign. Each lord controlled the roads through his territory, and each demanded payment for passage. A letter travelling from Paris to Rome might pass through dozens of such territories, each requiring negotiation, each adding delay and cost. It was in this fractured world that the next evolution of the postal service would emerge, not from any central authority, but from an unlikely source, a family of merchants with ambition and vision. The Taxis family, later known as Thurn und Taxis, were Italians who had built a fortune carrying messages for merchants and nobles. In the late 15th century, they approached the Holy Roman Emperor with a proposal. They would establish a reliable postal system throughout his territories. They would maintain stations, keep fresh horses, employ trained riders. In exchange, they wanted a monopoly on carrying mail and the right to charge fees. Emperor Maximilian I agreed. It was 1490, and the decision would shape European communication for the next 3 centuries. The Thurn und Taxis postal system was revolutionary not because of any technical innovation. The methods were largely the same as the Romans had used, but because of its organisational structure. It was a private company performing a public service, funded by user fees rather than state taxation. It was, in essence, the first truly modern postal system. But there is something unsettling about this arrangement, something worth examining carefully. When a private family controls the flow of information, when they have the legal authority to open any letter, to read any message, to delay or destroy anything that passes through their hands, what does that mean for truth, for privacy, for power? The Thurn und Taxis family became immensely wealthy. They knew every secret in Europe. They knew which nobles were plotting against their monarchs, which merchants were on the verge of bankruptcy, which cities were preparing for war. This knowledge was power, and they used it. They carried letters for everyone, but they served the interests of those who paid them best, who granted them privileges, who kept their monopoly secure. This is the second lesson. Whoever controls the mail controls the narrative, controls, in a very real sense, reality itself. The age of exploration brought new challenges and new possibilities. As European powers established colonies across the globe, the distances that needed to be bridged grew exponentially. A letter from London to the American colonies might take 2 months. If the ship survived the crossing, a message to India could take 6 months, to China even longer. Yet the need for communication only intensified. Colonial governors needed instructions from their home governments. Merchants needed to coordinate between continents. Colonists needed contact with the families they had left behind, the lives they were trying not to forget. The maritime postal system that developed was even more precarious than its land-based predecessor. Ships carrying mail could sink in storms, be captured by pirates, or simply vanish without explanation into the vast anonymity of the ocean. Entire bags of letters rest at the bottom of the Atlantic, messages that will never be read, questions that will never be answered, love that will never be reciprocated because the words expressing it dissolved in salt water. Consider the emotional weight of this. In an age when crossing the ocean often meant never returning, letters were not mere communication, they were lifelines. A colonist in Massachusetts waiting for word from England was not simply curious about news. They were desperate for confirmation that the people they loved still existed, still remembered them, still cared. And so they waited. Weeks turned to months. Months turned to years. Sometimes the letter came, travel-stained and barely legible, its seal broken by some official who had inspected its contents. Sometimes it never came, and the waiting turned into a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge that you would never know. This is what the Postal Service has always carried, not just information, but hope, and sometimes the crushing weight of hope deferred. The ships that carried these letters across the Atlantic were not purpose-built mail vessels. They were cargo ships, passenger ships, military vessels, whatever happened to be making the crossing. Mail was simply another form of cargo, stacked in the hold alongside barrels of rum and bales of cotton, subject to the same risks, the same indifferent ocean. But by the 18th century, certain ships began to be designated specifically for mail service. These were the packet ships, vessels that ran on regular schedules between ports, carrying mail and passengers. The term packet itself comes from the sealed packets of letters they transported, bundles wrapped in canvas and wax marked with destinations and postage paid. The packet ships represented a conceptual shift. For the first time, mail was not merely accommodated, it was the reason for the journey. These ships sailed on schedule whether they were full or nearly empty, whether the weather was favourable or threatening. The schedule itself became sacred, a promise made to everyone who entrusted their words to the service. This reliability came at tremendous cost. Packet ship crews were paid premium wages because they were expected to sail in conditions that merchant vessels would avoid. Winter crossings of the North Atlantic were particularly brutal. Waves that could snap masts, ice that formed on the rigging until the ship became top-heavy and threatened to capsize, storms that lasted for days without respite. The crews spoke of the mail as if it were alive, as if it had its own will that demanded to reach its destination. There are records of captains who, facing impossible conditions, would seal the mailbags in waterproof containers and attempt to save them even as the ship itself was breaking apart. The lives of the crew might be forfeit, but the mail must survive. Why? What drove this almost religious devotion to delivery? Perhaps it was simply professionalism, the pride of craftsmen in their work. But perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that these letters represented something more precious than their physical form. They were fragments of human consciousness, crystallized thoughts that would otherwise evaporate into nothingness. To lose them was to lose part of the human story itself. While packet ships crossed the oceans, on land, the postal system was evolving in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the Persian messengers or Roman couriers who had pioneered the concept. In Britain, a postal reformer named John Palmer proposed something radical in 1782, mail coaches. This seems obvious in retrospect. Why not carry mail in coaches rather than relying solely on individual riders? But Palmer's innovation was not merely about using coaches. It was about creating a system that was fast, reliable, and secure. Palmer's mail coaches were designed to carry both mail and passengers, but the mail took priority. The coaches ran on strict schedules, leaving at precise times and expected to arrive within narrow windows. Guards armed with blunderbusses rode alongside the driver, protecting the mail from highwaymen. The coaches themselves were painted in distinctive royal colours, maroon and black with red wheels, so they could be recognised from a distance. Most importantly, Palmer negotiated for the mail coaches to be exempt from the tolls that slowed all other traffic. This was not a minor matter. The roads of Britain were a patchwork of turnpikes, each privately maintained and each charging fees. A journey of 100 miles might require stopping at a dozen toll gates, each one adding delay and expense. The mail coaches passed through without stopping, the guards holding up a symbol of their authority as they thundered past. The effect was transformative. Overnight, mail delivery times were cut in half. Letters that had taken a week to travel from London to Edinburgh now arrived in 3 days. The regularity of the service meant that business and personal correspondence could be conducted with unprecedented efficiency. But there was another effect, subtler but perhaps more profound. The mail coaches, racing through the countryside on their immutable schedules, became symbols of modernity itself. They represented a world where time was no longer fluid and approximate, but measured and enforced. When villagers heard the mail coach horn in the distance, they could check their watches and know the time. The coaches were that reliable. This synchronization of time, this assumption that events happening in distant places could be coordinated to the minute, was something new in human history. It required and helped to create a psychological shift. The world was becoming, in some fundamental way, smaller, more connected, more simultaneous. Yet, even as the mail coaches represented the cutting edge of postal technology in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they were already being rendered obsolete by forces they could not outrun. The steam engine was awakening, and with it would come a transformation more radical than anything that had come before. The first steam locomotives were not designed for mail. They were designed to haul coal from mines, to move freight between factories, to solve the industrial problems of a Britain that was remaking itself in fire and iron. But the men who built these machines, George Stephenson and his son Robert, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and countless others whose names history has forgotten, understood that they were creating something more than transportation. They were creating a new relationship between human beings and distance. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened for passenger service. The locomotives that ran on its tracks could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour, faster than any horse could sustain, faster than any mail coach could achieve even on the best roads. Within a few years, railways were spreading across Britain like veins, connecting cities that had once been days apart. The Postal Service, always quick to adopt new technologies that promise speed, began using the railways almost immediately. At first, mail was simply loaded onto passenger trains, sorted at stations between runs. But postal officials quickly realized that the trains themselves offered an opportunity. What if mail could be sorted while in transit? What if the dead time of travel could be transformed into productive work? In 1838, the first travelling post office was introduced. This was a specialised railway car fitted with sorting cases, slots for different destinations, and desks where postal clerks could work as the train rushed through the darkness. The clerks, known as railway mail clerks, became a distinct and elite class within the postal service. They worked in conditions that would seem nightmarish by modern standards: cramped spaces lit by oil lamps, the constant noise and vibration of the train, the very real danger of derailments or collisions. But they were fast, impossibly, almost inhumanly fast. A skilled railway mail clerk could sort hundreds of letters per hour, his hands moving in practiced patterns even as the train swayed and jolted beneath him. The letters would be sorted not just by city but by neighbourhood, by street, by route, ready for immediate delivery when they arrived at their destination. There is something almost mechanical about this image, something that suggests humans becoming part of the machine itself. The clerks did not pause, they did not rest except during scheduled stops. They became, in a sense, extensions of the railway, their bodies and minds adapted to serve the system's needs. What did they think about these men as they worked through the night? Did they read the addresses and imagine the lives behind them? Did they notice patterns, the same handwriting appearing week after week, then stopping suddenly and forever? Did they feel the weight of the secrets they carried, the love letters and bills and legal documents and desperate pleas? Or did they train themselves not to see the letters as human things at all, but simply as objects to be sorted, problems to be solved? Perhaps that was the only way to maintain the speed the system demanded. The railway transformed not just the speed of mail delivery, but its very nature. For the first time in human history, mail could move faster than any individual could travel. A letter sent from London in the morning could arrive in Manchester that evening, but the sender, even if they left on the fastest train immediately after posting the letter, could not arrive before it. This seems like a trivial observation, but consider its implications. Information could now precede human presence. Actions could be taken, decisions made, based on communication from someone who is still days away from arriving in person. The letter became a kind of emissary, a representative of the self that could negotiate, explain, threaten, or seduce without the self being physically present. This changed business, changed politics, changed war. A general could coordinate movements across hundreds of miles, issuing orders that would be received and executed before he could possibly reach the battlefield himself. A merchant could make deals in a dozen cities simultaneously, his letters carrying his authority even as his body remained in one place. But there was loss in this as well. The letter, arriving before its sender, carried only partial information. It could not respond to questions, could not adapt to changing circumstances, could not see the recipient's face and adjust its message accordingly. The gap between the sending and the receiving of a letter became a kind of temporal void where misunderstanding could flourish. How many relationships fractured because a letter was misread, its tone misconstrued? How many business deals collapsed because crucial context was left out? How many wars might have been avoided if the people negotiating could have seen each other's expressions, heard the hesitation in each other's voices? The Postal Service, in making communication faster and more efficient, also made it more prone to the failures that come with mediation. The letter is always only a shadow of the person who wrote it, and shadows can deceive. In America, the development of the Postal Service followed a different trajectory, shaped by different geography and different political ideologies. The United States Postal Service has its origins in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where the founders explicitly granted Congress the power to establish post offices and post roads. This was not merely a practical provision. For the founders, the Postal Service was essential to the democratic experiment they were attempting. A republic requires informed citizens. It requires the free flow of information and ideas across distances. It requires, in other words, exactly what a postal system provides: the ability for people who are far apart to share thoughts, debate policies, organize politically. Benjamin Franklin, who had served as Postmaster General for the colonies under British rule, understood this better than most. He had seen how control of the mail could be used to suppress dissent, to isolate opposition, to maintain power. He had also seen how the Postal Service could unite disparate colonies into something resembling a nation. When he helped design the American postal system, he built into it certain principles that were, for their time, remarkably democratic. Newspapers could be mailed at extremely low rates, essentially subsidized by the government. This was intentional. The founders believed that an informed citizenry required access to news, and the Postal Service would be the vehicle for distributing that news across the vast distances of the new nation. Printers were encouraged to exchange newspapers with each other for free, creating a network of information sharing that strengthened the republic. The postal roads, highways designated for mail routes, were also public goods, maintained at public expense. As the nation expanded westward, post roads went first, cutting through wilderness, creating the infrastructure that settlement would follow. The Postal Service was not merely following American expansion, it was enabling it, making it possible. But there was a darker side to this as well. As white Americans pushed westward, the Postal Service they brought with them was a tool of colonization, a way of imposing American law and American culture on lands that had been indigenous for millennia. The post roads carved through hunting grounds. The post offices became centers of settlements that displaced native populations. The letters that traveled along these routes coordinated the military campaigns, the treaty negotiations, the administrative decisions that would result in genocide. The Postal Service was complicit in this. Not deliberately, perhaps. Postal workers were not, by and large, making policy decisions about westward expansion, but they were part of the machinery that made it possible. They were the nerves of an organism that was consuming a continent. This is uncomfortable to contemplate. We prefer to think of the Postal Service as neutral, as simply providing a service that people can use for good or ill according to their own consciences. But infrastructure is never neutral. It shapes what is possible, what is easy, what is profitable. By making communication fast and reliable between American settlements, while doing nothing to facilitate communication between native tribes, or between natives and whites on anything approaching equal terms, the Postal Service participated in the marginalization and eventual destruction of indigenous peoples. History is not a story of unmixed progress. Every advance carries within it the potential for new forms of harm. The steam engine that made the mail trains possible also made industrial warfare possible. The same organizational efficiency that allowed letters to be delivered across a continent also allowed armies to be coordinated, weapons to be distributed, orders for atrocities to arrive with inhuman speed. The American postal system faced challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to European postal services. The distances were staggering. A letter traveling from New York to San Francisco, once California joined the Union, had to cross nearly 3,000 miles of mountains, deserts, plains, and rivers. There were no railways connecting the coasts until 1869. Before then, mail had only a few options, none of them good. It could go by ship around South America, a journey of months through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Cape Horn, at the southern tip of the continent, was a graveyard of ships, its waters perpetually storm-tossed, its rocks hidden by fog and treacherous currents. Many vessels carrying mail simply disappeared there, lost without trace. Or mail could travel overland by stagecoach, a journey only marginally less dangerous. The coaches faced hostile terrain, unreliable water sources, extreme temperatures, and the very real threat of attack. The men who drove these coaches and the men who rode guard were paid well because they frequently died in service. There is a romanticism that has accrued to this era of American postal history, a sense of adventure and heroism. The Pony Express, which operated for only 18 months between 1860 and 1861, has become legendary far beyond its actual historical significance. Young men racing across the frontier on horseback, changing mounts at relay stations, carrying mail faster than it had ever been carried before. The image is iconic, but the reality was brutal. Pony Express riders were expected to cover 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles but riding continuously except for those brief stops. They rode through blizzards, through heat that could kill a horse in hours, through territories where they could be killed for the horse they rode or simply because they were white. The mail they carried was minimal, only the most urgent messages, letters written on the thinnest paper to save weight. Each rider was armed but travelling too fast to fight if attacked. Their only defence was speed and luck. Why did they do it? The pay was good by the standards of the time, about $25 a week when most labourers earned $1 a day. But that hardly seems sufficient compensation for the risk. Many of the riders were teenagers, boys seeking adventure or fleeing troubled lives. For them, the Pony Express offered something that money alone could not, a sense of purpose, of being part of something larger than themselves. They were, in their own minds, binding a nation together. The letters they carried were not just private correspondence. They were the evidence that despite the vast distances, despite the mountains and deserts that should have made unity impossible, America was one country, not two separated halves. When the transcontinental telegraph was completed in October 1861, the Pony Express became obsolete overnight. Messages that had taken 10 days to cross the continent now took minutes. The riders found themselves without work, their skills suddenly worthless. Many enlisted in the Civil War that was just beginning, trading one deadly occupation for another. The telegraph had done what no physical transportation system could. It had eliminated the time component of distance. A message no longer travelled through space at all, not in any meaningful sense. It was simply here, then there, with no journey between. This was the beginning of the end for the Postal Service as humanity had always known it, the physical carrying of messages across physical distance. Not the end, certainly. Letters would continue to be written and delivered for more than a century. But the fundamental nature of human communication had changed. From this point forward, there would always be faster ways to send urgent messages than physical mail. The Postal Service would have to find new purposes, new justifications for its existence. It would have to become something different from what it had been for thousands of years. The American Civil War, which erupted just as the telegraph was rendering the Pony Express obsolete, revealed both the power and the fragility of postal systems during times of national fracture. When the Confederate States seceded, they did not merely leave the Union, they severed the postal connections that had bound them to the North. The United States Postal Service continued to operate in Union territories, but Confederate mail was suddenly foreign correspondence, enemy communication, that had to be intercepted, censored, or destroyed. The Confederacy established its own postal service, appointing John Henninger Reagan as Postmaster General. He faced an impossible task, creating a functional mail system in a new nation that had no established infrastructure, no reliable currency, and an economy increasingly strangled by Union blockades. Confederate postage stamps became works of desperate improvisation. As supplies dwindled, they were printed on whatever paper could be found, sometimes on the backs of old documents, sometimes on wallpaper. The adhesive that held them to envelopes failed in the southern humidity. Letters arrived with stamps that had fallen off somewhere along their journey, creating confusion about whether postage had been paid. But people kept writing letters. Soldiers in both armies sent and received mail with an urgency that seems almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. These were not men who expected to survive the war. The mathematics were clear. In some battles, casualties exceeded 50%. A soldier writing a letter home was often writing what he knew might be his last words to the people he loved. The Postal Service, Union and Confederate both, treated these letters with something approaching reverence. Military mail was given priority over civilian correspondence. Postal workers, themselves often too old or too young to serve in combat, saw their work as a form of war service. They understood that the letters they handled might be all that remained of men who would never come home. There are records of postal clerks who memorized the handwriting of soldiers who could recognize a particular private scrawl among hundreds of letters. When the handwriting stopped appearing, when a soldier's letters suddenly ceased, the clerks would sometimes make quiet inquiries, trying to learn if their correspondent had been killed or merely transferred to a unit where mail service was less reliable. This practice was unofficial, of course. It was not part of any postal regulation, but it speaks to something fundamental about the human beings who have always operated postal systems. They are not merely moving objects from one place to another. They are handling the most intimate artifacts of human connection, and that handling changes them. Between the battle lines, in the contested territories where neither Union nor Confederate authority held firm sway, the mail became a weapon and a target. Postal routes were raided by guerrilla fighters. Mail coaches were burned. Letters were seized and read for intelligence, names of sympathizers, movements of troops, economic information that might be useful. Some letters were never intended to reach their stated destinations. They were messages in a bottle, sent knowing they would likely be intercepted, containing disinformation meant to confuse enemy commanders. Others carried coded messages, innocent-seeming family letters that contained intelligence hidden in prearranged patterns. A wife writing to her soldier husband about household matters might mention that Aunt Margaret visited last Tuesday, or the roses bloomed early this year, phrases that meant nothing to a censor but conveyed crucial information to the intended recipient. The Postal Service, which had been designed to connect people, had become a battlefield. Every letter was potentially dangerous. Every postal worker was a potential spy or collaborator. Trust, which had always been essential to the mail, the trust that your letter would arrive, that it would not be read by unauthorized eyes, that the Postal Service was neutral infrastructure serving everyone equally, had been shattered. When the war ended in 1865, reuniting the postal systems was not merely a logistical challenge, it was a symbolic act, a statement that the nation was one again. Former Confederate postal workers were reintegrated into the United States Postal Service. Routes that had been severed were reconnected. Mail began flowing again between North and South, but the damage went deeper than infrastructure. The generation that had lived through the war would never again have the same faith in the privacy and security of their correspondence. They had seen too clearly how mail could be weaponized, how communication itself could become a liability. Some would continue to write their letters in codes and ciphers for the rest of their lives, unable to shake the habits born of necessity during the war years. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 marked the beginning of the Postal Service's golden age in America. For the first time, mail could travel from coast to coast entirely by rail, making the journey in less than a week. The railway mail service, which had been operating in the East since the 1830s, now extended across the entire nation. The railway mail clerks who worked these routes became legendary figures. They developed sorting systems of almost inhuman complexity, memorizing the names and locations of thousands of post offices, knowing instinctively where each letter needed to go. They worked in railway cars that were essentially travelling post offices, fitted with hundreds of sorting slots, each one representing a different destination. The most famous of these was the Fast Mail, trains specially designed for mail transport that ran express schedules with minimal stops. These trains were the fastest things on the rails, given priority over passenger and freight traffic. They were also the most dangerous assignments in the railway mail service. Derailments were common. The speeds the fast mail trains achieved, 60-70 miles per hour on good track, were at the very edge of what the technology of the era could sustain. A broken rail, a washed-out bridge, a miscommunication between signal towers, any of these could send a fast mail train hurtling off the tracks. When it happened, the railway mail clerks often died. They worked in wooden cars, typically placed directly behind the locomotive, where they would feel the least motion from the train. This meant they absorbed the full force of any collision or derailment. The mail car was frequently crushed, splintered into kindling, the clerks inside killed instantly or pinned in the wreckage. But the mail usually survived. The bags of letters, tossed clear during the crash or protected by their sheer volume, could often be recovered and sent on to their destinations. There are documented cases of railway mail clerks who, dying in the wreckage of their car, used their last moments to protect the mail, throwing sacks clear of flames or covering them with their own bodies. This seems like insanity. What could possess a person to value letters, pieces of paper written by strangers, above their own survival? Yet it happened repeatedly, across decades, on railways throughout the world. The railway postal services of America. Britain, France, and Germany all have similar stories. Men who died for the mail they carried. Perhaps it was simply training, institutional conditioning so deep that it overrode self-preservation instinct. Perhaps it was pride, the professional identity of a railway mail clerk so fundamental to their sense of self that protecting the mail was protecting who they were. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that is most unsettling, perhaps they understood something that we have forgotten. Perhaps they understood that the letters they carried were not merely objects, but embodiments of human connection, crystallized relationships that could not be replaced. If a love letter burned, that particular expression of love was lost forever. If a business contract was destroyed, livelihoods might be ruined. If a soldier's last letter home never arrived, his family might never know what happened to him. The railway mail clerks were the guardians of these irreplaceable things, and some of them took that guardianship so seriously that they would die rather than fail in their duty. While railways were transforming mail delivery on land, a parallel revolution was occurring at sea. The steam-powered ocean liner, which began to replace sailing ships in the mid-19th century, brought predictability and speed to transoceanic mail service. The first regular transatlantic steamship service began in 1838. when the SS Great Western made the crossing from Bristol to New York in 15 days. This was faster than any sailing vessel could reliably achieve, and more importantly, it was consistent. Steam power meant that ships no longer depended on favourable winds. They could maintain schedules regardless of weather, arriving within narrow windows that made coordinated mail delivery possible. By the 1850s, competing steamship lines were vying for postal contracts, building ever larger and faster vessels specifically designed to carry mail and passengers across the Atlantic. The Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, Cunard Line, and later the White Star Line turned the Atlantic crossing into a scheduled service as reliable as any train route. But the ocean remained the ocean. Steam power could overcome unfavourable winds, but it could not overcome storms, icebergs, or the fundamental hostility of deep water to human life. Ships still sank. Mail still went to the bottom. The most famous loss of mail in maritime history occurred on April 15, 1912, when the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. The ship was carrying 3,423 sacks of mail, approximately 7 million individual letters. Among the Titanic's dead were 5 railway mail clerks who had been working in the ship's mail room when the collision occurred. These men, John Starr March, Oscar Scott Woody, William Logan Gwynn, John Richard Jago Smith, and James Bertram Williamson, were faced with an impossible situation. The mailroom was flooding, the ship was sinking, escape was possible, perhaps even likely, if they abandoned their post immediately. They did not abandon their post. Survivors reported seeing them carrying sacks of mail up from the flooding hold, trying to save what they could. They worked until the water rose too high, until the ship listed too steeply for them to keep their footing. All 5 died. The mail they died trying to save went down with the ship, settling into the abyssal depths where it remains today, the paper long since dissolved, the words long since lost to darkness and pressure and time. Why? The question echoes across the century that separates us from that night. Why would anyone die for mail? For letters that were not addressed to them, that they would never read, that concerned lives they knew nothing about? The answer, if there is one, lies in the nature of duty and identity. The railway mail clerks, both on trains and ships, were not simply postal workers. They were members of an elite service corps that took pride in its reputation for absolute reliability. Their motto, borrowed from Herodotus's description of the Persian messengers, was that nothing would prevent them from completing their appointed rounds. Not snow, not rain, not heat, not darkness, and not, apparently, even death itself. To abandon the mail to save themselves while letting the letters sink would have been to betray everything they understood themselves to be. It would have been a kind of death anyway, the death of identity, of purpose, of the meaning that structured their lives. So they stayed, they worked, they died, and the world remembered them as heroes, which is perhaps the only compensation available for such sacrifice. The early 20th century brought new technologies that would once again transform the nature of mail delivery. The automobile, the airplane, and eventually the rocket would each be adapted for postal use, each promising to make communication faster, more reliable, more ubiquitous. The first automobile mail delivery route in the United States began in 1896, when a single car was used to transport mail between post offices in Cleveland, Ohio. The experiment was not initially successful. The car broke down frequently, roads were unpaved and treacherous, and postal officials were skeptical that automobiles could replace proven technologies like horse-drawn wagons. But the automobile had advantages that became undeniable. It didn't require feeding or rest. It could operate in any weather a horse could manage, and some that horses couldn't. And as internal combustion engines improved and roads were paved, automobiles became faster and more reliable than any horse-drawn vehicle. By the 1920s, the transition was complete. Rural mail carriers, who had previously driven horse-drawn wagons along routes that could take all day to complete, now drove automobiles that cut delivery times in half. The Post Office Department purchased thousands of vehicles specifically designed for mail delivery, sturdy, reliable, able to handle unpaved rural roads. The iconic image of the rural mail carrier driving a battered car or truck along dusty country roads, stopping at isolated farmhouses to deliver letters and small packages, became part of the American landscape. These carriers were often the only regular contact isolated farming families had with the outside world. They brought news, gossip, and sometimes, in emergencies, help. There are countless stories of rural mail carriers who went far beyond their official duties. Carriers who checked on elderly residents along their routes, who noticed when newspapers were accumulating uncollected, and investigated to find someone who had fallen and couldn't get up. Carriers who delivered medicine, who transported people to hospitals in emergencies, who served as informal social workers for the communities they served. This was never part of their job description, but the job description didn't capture what being a mail carrier actually meant in rural America. It meant being a connection to the wider world, a lifeline, a familiar presence in places where strangers were rare and often unwelcome. The airplane entered postal service even before it became a reliable means of passenger transport. The first official airmail flight in the United States occurred on September 23, 1911, when pilot Earl Ovington flew a sack of mail from Garden City, New York to Mineola, covering a distance of about 6 miles. This seems almost comically short. 6 miles in an era when trains were already carrying mail thousands of miles. But it demonstrated a principle that would become increasingly important. Airmail didn't need to be faster than trains over long distances. It just needed to cross geographical barriers that trains couldn't. By 1918, the Post Office Department had established the first regular airmail route between Washington, D.C. and New York City. The flights were dangerous. Aircraft of the era were primitive, prone to mechanical failure, vulnerable to bad weather. Pilots flew without instruments, navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning. Many died. In the first decade of airmail service, 31 of the first 40 pilots hired by the post office were killed in crashes. The life expectancy of an airmail pilot was measured in months, not years. Yet there was never a shortage of applicants. Young men, often veterans of World War I's aerial combat, signed up knowing the odds. Drawn by the adventure and the decent pay, the airmail pilots developed a culture of reckless courage. They flew in fog when no sane person would leave the ground. They flew through storms that tossed their fragile aircraft like leaves. They flew at night before the invention of lighted airways, finding their way by the dim glow of bonfires lit by postal workers at emergency landing fields along the route. Why would anyone accept such risk to deliver mail? For some, it was simply the money. Airmail pilots were well compensated, at least by the standards of the time. For others, it was the thrill, the intoxication of flight in an era when human beings in the air was still a miraculous novelty. But for many, there was something else, a sense that they were participating in the future, that every flight they completed, every load of mail they delivered, was proof that a new age of human capability had arrived. They were right. By the 1930s, airmail had become routine. Routes crossed the continent and eventually the oceans. Aircraft became larger, more reliable, capable of flying in conditions that would have grounded the earlier generation of planes. The death rate dropped. Flying the mail became, if not safe, at least survivable. But something was lost in that transition from desperate adventure to routine service. The early airmail pilots had seen themselves as pioneers, as heroes. The pilots who came after were professionals, skilled and competent, but no longer mythic figures. The mail moved faster, more reliably, but it moved without drama, without the romance that had characterized its delivery in the early days of aviation. Perhaps this is inevitable. Every technology passes through a heroic phase and emerges into mundane competence. The mail, which had once required courage and sacrifice to deliver, was becoming simply mail, a service that worked, that people relied on, that rarely merited a second thought. This is success, of course. A postal service that functions so reliably that people don't think about it is a postal service fulfilling its purpose. But there is something melancholy about the way that reliability erases the human cost, the way that smooth operation makes invisible all the deaths and sacrifice and courage that made that operation possible. The modern postal service sits atop a foundation of bodies. The Persian messengers who died of exhaustion, the Roman couriers killed by bandits, the packet ship crews drowned in storms, the railway mail clerks crushed in derailments, the airmail pilots who flew into mountains they couldn't see. We rarely think of them. We drop a letter in a mailbox and trust it will arrive, never considering the centuries of incremental improvement, each increment paid for in blood, that make that trust justified. The transition from horses to steam trains to automobiles and airplanes was not merely a story of technological advancement. It was a story of changing human relationships with time, distance, and each other. Each new technology didn't simply make mail delivery faster. It altered the fundamental expectations people had about communication. When mail travelled by horse, people understood that letters were slow. A response might take weeks or months. Patience was not a virtue, it was a necessity. People wrote differently knowing this. Letters were longer, more complete, attempting to anticipate questions that might arise because the back and forth of conversation was impossible. A single letter might contain what would later be split across dozens of messages. The telegraph began to erode this patience. Suddenly, urgent messages could be sent and received within hours or even minutes. But the telegraph was expensive and limited. You couldn't send casual thoughts or lengthy explanations via telegraph. It was for emergencies, for business, for news that couldn't wait. The telephone, when it arrived, created yet another tier of immediacy, voice-to-voice communication, instantaneous across distances that had once required days to bridge. But telephone service was initially restricted to cities, to the wealthy, to businesses that could afford the installation and service costs. So, through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these different communication technologies coexisted, each serving different needs, each operating at different speeds. The postal service remained the universal option, available to everyone regardless of location or wealth. It was slow compared to telegraph or telephone, but it was reliable, affordable, and most importantly, it reached everywhere. Rural free delivery, established in 1896, extended postal service to farms and small communities that had previously required residents to travel to the nearest post office, sometimes many miles away, to collect their mail. Now, 6 days a week, a mail carrier would bring letters and newspapers directly to farmhouse mailboxes. This seemingly simple change had profound social effects. Rural isolation decreased. Farmers could order goods from catalogues. Sears, Roebuck and Company built an empire on catalogue sales delivered via rural free delivery. Information about new agricultural techniques, market prices, political news, all began flowing to places that had previously been cut off from such knowledge. But there was loss as well. The weekly or monthly trip to town to collect mail had been a social occasion, a chance to see neighbours, to exchange gossip, to conduct business face to face. When the mail came to you, that reason to leave the farm diminished. Some communities became more isolated even as their communication with the distant world increased. This paradox, that technologies of connection can simultaneously enable certain kinds of community while dissolving others, would repeat throughout the 20th century. The postal service, by becoming more efficient and comprehensive, changed what it meant to be connected to other people. The two world wars of the 20th century tested postal systems in ways that revealed both their resilience and their vulnerability. During World War I, the volume of mail moving between soldiers at the front and their families at home reached unprecedented levels. Millions of letters, billions of words, attempting to bridge the unbridgeable gap between the trenches and home. Military censorship created a new tension in postal service. Letters from soldiers were read by censors who would black out or cut away any information that might be useful to the enemy. Troop locations, movements, casualties, morale. Soldiers learned to write in careful generalities, describing the weather, asking about family, expressing love, while saying nothing about the horror they were experiencing. The families receiving these letters understood what the silences meant. A letter that arrived with many censored sections was a letter from someone in combat, someone in danger. A letter with few redactions might mean a posting to a quieter sector. The physical appearance of the letter, the weight of the paper, the neatness of the handwriting, the presence or absence of mud or bloodstains, conveyed information that the words, constrained by censorship, could not. There evolved an entire vocabulary of subtext, of reading between lines. I am well might mean I am alive but traumatized. The weather here is unpleasant might mean we are being shelled constantly. Families became adept at this interpretation, passing sentences for clues about what was really happening. The postal workers who handled military mail developed their own awareness of these patterns. They could recognize which units were suffering heavy casualties by the sudden decrease in mail from particular sectors. They could sense when an offensive was being planned by the increase in letters written with the urgency of men who thought they might not survive the coming battle. This knowledge was unofficial, of course. Postal workers were not military intelligence, but they were witnesses to the emotional landscape of the war in ways that few others were. They saw the letters from the front dwindle to nothing from particular addresses. They saw the official telegrams, we regret to inform you, that followed those silences. They delivered the letters that soldiers had written to be sent in the event of my death, final messages from men who were already gone. What does it do to a person to be the bearer of such messages, to walk up to a house knowing that the envelope you carry will shatter the life of whoever opens it? Many postal workers from this era spoke later about the weight of that duty. Some requested transfers away from routes where they had delivered too many death notifications. Others stayed, feeling that someone who knew the families, someone who cared, should be the one to bring such news. There was no training for this, no procedure, just the human task of being present in someone else's worst moment. World War II brought even greater volumes of mail and new technological innovations. V-mail, Victory Mail, was a system designed to reduce the physical volume of letters while maintaining the ability to send personal messages. Letters were written on special forms, then photographed onto microfilm. The microfilm was shipped overseas, where it was developed and printed at reduced size for delivery. This meant that a single aircraft could carry hundreds of thousands of letters, weight and volume reduced to almost nothing. The system was efficient, practical, a triumph of organization and technology. It was also deeply impersonal. The letter your loved one received was not the paper you had touched, not the ink from your pen. It was a photographic reproduction, smaller than the original, standardized, stripped of the physical connection that made letters intimate objects. Soldiers and their families used V-mail because it was faster and more reliable than regular mail. But many continued to send traditional letters as well, paying extra for the privilege of having their actual words, on their actual paper, delivered. The physical object mattered. The knowledge that this piece of paper had been in the hands of someone you loved, had travelled with them perhaps, had been carried in their pocket, this knowledge was worth the extra cost and delay. The Postal Service has always carried two things, information and physical presence. A letter tells you what someone thought, but the letter itself, the object, tells you that someone took the time to write to you, to fold the paper, to address the envelope, to post it. In the age of V-mail and later in the age of email, this dual nature became separated. Information could be transmitted instantly, but the physical presence, the sense of connection to the actual person who wrote the message, was lost. The late 20th century brought challenges to the Postal Service that were fundamentally different from anything it had faced before. Previous technological changes, from horses to trains, from trains to automobiles and airplanes, had simply made the Postal Service faster and more efficient. But telecommunications technologies threatened to make physical mail obsolete. The fax machine, introduced in the 1980s, allowed documents to be transmitted instantly over telephone lines. Email, which became widely available in the 1990s, allowed messages to be sent and received in seconds at essentially no cost. Text messaging, smartphones, instant messaging applications. Each new technology made physical mail seem slower, more expensive, more unnecessary. Postal services around the world saw letter volumes decline. In the United States, first-class mail, personal and business correspondence, peaked in 2001 and has been declining ever since. The letters that had sustained the Postal Service for centuries, the core purpose for which it had been created, were disappearing. And yet the Postal Service did not collapse, it adapted. Package delivery, driven initially by catalogue shopping and later by e-commerce, grew to replace the lost letter volume. The infrastructure that had been built to deliver letters proved equally capable of delivering small packages. The mail carriers who had once primarily carried letters now carried boxes, books, clothing, electronics, all the purchases of a society that had shifted from shopping in physical stores to shopping online. This transformation was neither simple nor painless. Postal services had to retrain workers, redesign sorting facilities, negotiate with e-commerce companies that demanded lower rates for their massive shipping volumes. The economics of the Postal Service changed fundamentally. Letters were lightweight and high margin, packages were heavy and low margin. Profitability declined even as work volume increased. But there is an irony in this that's worth contemplating. The technologies that were supposed to kill the Postal Service, the internet, email, online shopping, instead created a new dependence on physical delivery. When you order something online, when you click a button and expect a package to arrive at your door, you are relying on the same infrastructure that delivered letters in the age of horses and steam trains. The addresses are the same. The sorting systems, though modernized, follow the same logic. The mail carriers, though now driving modern vehicles, are doing essentially what their predecessors did a century ago, taking things from one place and bringing them to another. The Postal Service, rather than becoming obsolete, revealed itself to be more fundamental than any particular technology. It is the physical manifestation of connection, the proof that you can reach across distance and touch someone else's life in a tangible way. There is something deeply human about wanting a physical object that has travelled from another person to you. Email is instant and convenient, but an email is not an object. It doesn't exist in space. You cannot hold it, cannot put it in a box to save, cannot randomly discover it years later and be transported back to the moment you first read it. A letter is different. A letter is a piece of paper that someone touched. It carries the physical marks of its creation, the pressure of the pen, the slight smudge where a word was corrected, maybe even the scent of the place where it was written. It travels through the world, accumulating its own small history of handling, sorting, transporting. By the time it reaches you, it has been touched by dozens of people, has travelled hundreds or thousands of miles, has persisted through weather and machinery and the simple entropy that destroys most things. This persistence, this physical journey, matters in ways that are difficult to articulate but deeply felt. A letter from someone you love is not just information. It is a gift of their time, their attention, their physical presence translated into an object that exists in the world. The Postal Service, at its core, has always been about making such gifts possible. Everything else, the horses, the trains, the planes, the complex sorting systems, the vast networks of routes and schedules, all of it exists to serve this simple human need, to send something of yourself to someone else. As the 21st century progresses, this becomes both more precious and more rare. We live in an age of instant communication, of messages sent and received in seconds, of video calls that let us see each other's faces across any distance. We have overcome, in many ways, the very problem that the Postal Service was created to solve. And yet people still write letters. Not as many as before, certainly, but they do it. They choose the slower, more expensive, more effortful option because they understand, perhaps unconsciously, that there is value in the physical object, in the journey it takes, in the intention required to create and send it. A letter says, "You are worth this effort, worth the time to write, to address, to post, worth waiting for a response rather than expecting instant gratification, worth connecting with in a way that leaves a physical trace in the world." The history of the postal service, from horses to steam trains, is not merely a history of technological progress. It is a history of human persistence in the face of distance, of the stubborn refusal to accept that space must separate us from each other. The Persian messengers who died of exhaustion carrying their emperor's commands understood this. So did the packet ship crews who sailed into storms, the railway mail clerks who sorted letters while their train raced through the night, the airmail pilots who flew through fog without instruments. They were all, in their different ways, fighting the same enemy, the isolation that distance imposes on human consciousness. We are, each of us, trapped in our own minds, our own immediate physical location. Everything we know directly is what we can sense within arm's reach. Everything else is mediated, indirect, dependent on information that must travel to us through space and time. The Postal Service is one of the oldest and most persistent technologies for overcoming this limitation. It allows consciousness to travel, thoughts to move from one mind to another, connection to persist despite the miles between us. In an age of instant communication, this might seem quaint, unnecessary, a relic of a slower time. But the Postal Service endures because it serves something fundamental. Not just the need for information transfer, but the need for physical connection, for tangible proof that we are not alone. When you receive a letter, when you hold in your hands a piece of paper that travelled from someone else to you, you are participating in a tradition that extends back thousands of years. Back to the first messenger who ran between cities carrying news, back to the first person who realized that words could be preserved and transported, that the self could be extended beyond the body through the technology of writing. The horses and steam trains are mostly gone now, replaced by trucks and planes and sophisticated logistics networks, but the purpose remains the same. The Postal Service still does what it has always done. It carries pieces of human consciousness across the distance that separates us, proving again and again that isolation is not inevitable, that connection is possible, that we can reach each other despite everything that keeps us apart. This is not a small thing. This is in fact one of the most important things humans have ever created. And it began with a person willing to run, to ride, to risk themselves, carrying a message that said, "I am here. Are you there?" The answer, carried back across whatever distance, whatever danger, has always been the same. Yes, I am here. I hear you. You are not alone. The Industrial Revolution that gave birth to steam-powered trains and ships also gave birth to something else, the modern concept of time itself. Before railways, each town kept its own time, set by the position of the sun. Noon in London was not the same as noon in Bristol, which was not the same as noon in Edinburgh. The differences were small, minutes, not hours, but they were real. This worked well enough when travel was slow. If it took days to journey between cities, a few minutes difference in local time was irrelevant. But trains operated on schedules measured in minutes. A train leaving London at noon needed to coordinate with trains arriving from other cities, and this coordination required a shared understanding of what noon meant. The railways forced the standardization of time. By the 1840s, railway time, based on Greenwich Mean Time, had become the de facto standard across Britain. The Postal Service, which relied on railway connections and operated on similarly precise schedules, reinforced this standardization. Mail trains left at specific times, coordinated across the network, treating time as an absolute rather than a local variation. This seems like a technical detail, but it represents a profound shift in human consciousness. For all of history until this moment, time had been a local phenomenon, something determined by your immediate environment, now was becoming universal, synchronized, a grid that overlaid the entire nation and eventually the entire world. The Postal Service was both cause and effect of this transformation. It needed synchronized time to function efficiently, and its functioning made synchronized time necessary for everyone else. If you wanted to catch the mail train, if you wanted your letter to reach its destination according to the posted schedule, you had to adopt the new understanding of time, precise, measured, universal. This synchronization of time was, in a sense, the synchronization of consciousness itself. People in distant cities were now living in the same temporal moment, their watches set to the same standard, their days structured by the same framework. The Postal Service, by connecting these distant places with regular, scheduled service, made this synchronization meaningful. It didn't matter that London and Edinburgh shared the same time if there was no reliable way to communicate between them. But with daily mail service, with letters arriving according to published schedules, the shared time became a shared reality. The sorting of mail, which seems like a mundane administrative task, conceals within it a fascinating intellectual challenge. How do you organize information about location in a way that allows rapid, accurate routing? The earliest postal systems used simple destination-based sorting. A letter going to Rome was put in the Rome bag. A letter going to Athens went in the Athens bag. This worked when there were only a few destinations, but as postal networks grew to encompass thousands of delivery points, simple alphabetical sorting became inadequate. The solution, developed gradually over the 19th century, was hierarchical addressing. A letter wasn't just going to a city, it was going to a specific street, a specific building, a specific person. The Postal Service developed systems for encoding this hierarchy into addresses, and more importantly, for training postal workers to pass these addresses rapidly. Railway mail clerks, working in moving trains with hundreds of letters to sort per hour, developed mnemonic systems of extraordinary sophistication. They memorized not just cities and towns, but the relationships between them, which places were on which railway lines, which sorting centres served which regions, which mail pouches should be dropped at which stations. A skilled railway mail clerk could glance at an address and know instantly which of the dozens of sorting slots before him should receive it, his hands moving faster than conscious thought, his mind operating on patterns learned through years of practice. They called this casing, the ability to sort mail into cases with automatic precision. But there was an art to this as well. Addresses were not always clear, handwriting was often illegible. People made mistakes, transposed numbers, misspelled street names. A letter addressed to John Smith somewhere in Pennsylvania would defeat an automated system entirely. But a skilled postal clerk might remember that there was a John Smith on rural Route 3 outside of Lancaster, and if the postmark was from nearby, that was probably the intended destination. This kind of contextual knowledge, accumulated over years of handling mail, was invaluable and irreplaceable. It was also inevitably being lost. As postal systems mechanized, as sorting machines replaced human clerks, this intuitive understanding of place and connection was encoded into algorithms and databases. The machines were faster, more consistent, less prone to fatigue, but they could not make the creative leaps that human clerks made, could not use context and experience to route the unroutable. There is a parallel here to what was happening throughout industrialized society. Human skills honed over lifetimes were being replaced by mechanical processes that could perform the same tasks more efficiently but without understanding, without the accumulated wisdom that comes from doing something not just correctly but meaningfully. The golden age of the railway mail service, roughly from 1870 to 1930, coincided with what might be called the peak of letter-writing culture in Western society. Literacy rates were high enough that most people could write, but electronic communication had not yet displaced the written letter. The result was a volume of personal correspondence that had never existed before and would never exist again. People wrote letters constantly, not just for important occasions, but for everyday communication. A businessman might write a dozen letters a day. A young woman away at boarding school would write to her family weekly. Friends separated by distance maintained relationships through regular correspondence that could span decades. These were not the carefully composed formal letters of earlier eras. They were conversational, intimate, full of the small details of daily life. People wrote about the weather, about what they had for dinner, about the annoying habits of their neighbours. They wrote because writing a letter was the way you maintained connection with people who weren't physically present. The Postal Service made this possible not just by delivering letters, but by making delivery reliable and affordable enough that ordinary people could participate. When postage was expensive, letters were reserved for important matters. But as costs dropped, in the United States, a letter could be sent anywhere in the country for just a few cents. By the late 19th century, letters became democratic, accessible to everyone. This democratization of communication had effects that rippled through society in unexpected ways. Families separated by migration could maintain relationships across continents. Social movements could coordinate actions across regions. Ideas could spread not just through official publications, but through networks of personal correspondence. The abolition movement in the United States, for instance, relied heavily on networks of letter writers who shared news, strategies, and moral support. The labor movement used the mail to coordinate strikes and boycotts across different cities. The women's suffrage movement maintained cohesion across vast distances through regular correspondence between activists. These letters were not public documents. They were private correspondence between individuals. But cumulatively, they created networks of connection and coordination that made collective action possible in ways it had never been before. The Postal Service, by simply doing its job, delivering letters reliably and affordably, enabled the formation of civil society itself, the networks of voluntary association that exist between the individual and the state. This was never the intent of postal policy, but it was the inevitable result. When you make communication cheap and reliable, you empower people to organize themselves in ways that no authority can fully control. There is a darkness in this history as well, a shadow that falls across the seemingly benign narrative of progress and connection. The Postal Service has always been, simultaneously, a tool of freedom and a tool of surveillance. Every letter that passes through the postal system is visible to the system. The address is read by postal workers, recorded by postal authorities. In times of political tension, this information has always been used for monitoring and control. During the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate postal authorities maintained lists of suspicious correspondence, people whose mail was routinely opened and read. Political dissidents, suspected spies, anyone thought to be communicating with the enemy. Their letters were intercepted, copied, sometimes destroyed. This was not aberrational, it was standard practice. The privacy of mail has always been more theoretical than real. Postal authorities have consistently claimed the right to open mail when they suspect it contains contraband, when national security is at stake, when any number of justifications are invoked. In Britain during World War I, a dedicated censorship staff of over 4,500 people examined mail passing through the postal system. They read personal letters, looking for any information that might be useful to German intelligence, any hint of defeatism or dissent that might threaten the war effort. Similar systems operated in France, Germany, and eventually the United States when it entered the war. The people whose letters were read were not criminals or spies, or at least the vast majority were not. They were ordinary citizens whose crime was living in a time when the state believed it needed to know everything. The postal workers who read these letters, who violated the privacy of millions of strangers, were doing their patriotic duty as they understood it. But what does it do to a society when everyone knows their correspondence might be read? When every letter must be written with the awareness that unseen eyes might scan it for forbidden content? It creates a climate of self-censorship. People learn to write carefully, to avoid topics that might be misconstrued, to keep their true thoughts private, even in supposedly private correspondence. The letter, which should be a space of intimate honesty, becomes a performance for potential surveillance. This is not ancient history. Postal surveillance has continued throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. During the Cold War, the United States operated a mail opening program called HT Lingual that examined correspondence between American citizens and people in communist countries. The program ran from 1952 to 1973, opening and photographing hundreds of thousands of letters without warrant or notification. When the program was exposed, there was public outcry, but also public acceptance. Many Americans believed, or claimed to believe, that such surveillance was necessary for national security. The privacy of the mail was a nice ideal, but in a dangerous world, ideals had to give way to practical necessities. The same logic has been applied to every subsequent surveillance program. The same trade-off, privacy for security, has been offered and accepted again and again. And the Postal Service, which was supposed to be a neutral infrastructure serving everyone equally, has been complicit in this compromise. By the mid-20th century, the fundamental technologies of mail delivery had largely stabilized. Letters and packages moved by truck and airplane, sorted in mechanized facilities, delivered by carriers following optimized routes. The system was efficient, comprehensive, reliable. But something had changed in the nature of what was being delivered. The letters that had once formed the bulk of postal traffic were declining in both volume and importance. Business correspondence was moving to telephone and later to fax and email. Personal letters were becoming rarer as people found it easier to call rather than write. What remained were bills, advertisements, and packages. The Postal Service was becoming less a carrier of human communication and more a logistics network for commerce. This shift was gradual, nearly imperceptible, but profound. A letter is a gift of attention and time. A bill is a demand. An advertisement is an intrusion. Packages are objects of desire, things we've purchased, things we're waiting for, but they don't carry the same emotional weight as letters. You don't save a package in a box in the attic to reread years later and remember who you were when it arrived. The postal workers who delivered mail in the mid-20th century noticed this change. Older carriers spoke nostalgically about the days when mail had been primarily letters, when they had felt like they were connecting people to each other rather than simply distributing commercial material. But perhaps this nostalgia was misplaced. Perhaps the Postal Service was simply evolving to meet the needs of a changing society. If people preferred to communicate by telephone, if businesses found it more efficient to send bills electronically, if commerce was shifting online, well, the Postal Service would adapt or become irrelevant. And adapt it did. By the late 20th century, postal services around the world were increasingly focused on package delivery, competing with private courier companies like UPS and FedEx. The rise of e-commerce in the late 1990s and early 2000s created explosive growth in package volumes, growth that continues to this day. Yet there is something melancholy about this transformation. The Postal Service was born from the human need to communicate across distance. It was created to carry thoughts, words, feelings, the immaterial stuff of human consciousness made tangible through writing. To see it become primarily a logistics network for moving consumer goods is to see a kind of spiritual decline, a victory of commerce over connection. Or perhaps that's too romantic. Perhaps the Postal Service was always primarily about commerce, about the efficient movement of information and goods that enabled economic activity. The letters were never the point, they were just one form of cargo among many. From this perspective, the shift from letters to packages is not a decline, but simply a continuation of the Postal Service's core function, moving things from where they are to where they need to be. The men and women who have worked in postal services, the carriers, the clerks, the sorters, the drivers, have always occupied a peculiar position in society. They are simultaneously invisible and essential, taken for granted until they're absent. A mail carrier walks the same route day after day, year after year, becoming a familiar presence in the neighborhood they serve. Children learn to recognize them. Dogs learn their schedule. Elderly residents wait for their arrival, for the brief human contact that might be their only interaction of the day. But to most people, the mail carrier is functionally invisible. They're part of the infrastructure, like the water pipes or electrical wires, noticed only when something goes wrong, when mail doesn't arrive, when the expected becomes unexpectedly absent. This invisibility is, in a sense, a measure of success. The Postal Service works best when it's so reliable that people don't think about it. But it also means that the human beings who make the system work are rarely seen or appreciated for what they do. A mail carrier walks miles every day in all weather conditions. They know their route intimately. Every house, every mailbox, every dog that might bite, every porch that's slippery when wet. They notice things that others miss. Newspapers piling up that might indicate someone in trouble, unfamiliar cars that might signal a burglary, small changes in the neighborhood's rhythm that could be important. Sometimes they intervene. Sometimes they save lives. There are countless stories of mail carriers who noticed that an elderly person's mail hadn't been collected and investigated to find them collapsed, injured, unable to call for help. Stories of carriers who smelled smoke and alerted residents to fires before they spread. Stories of carriers who recognized signs of domestic violence or child abuse and reported them to authorities. None of this is in their job description. Their job is to deliver mail, nothing more. But the job, as actually practiced, requires them to be observers, to care about the people on their route, to pay attention in ways that go far beyond simply putting letters in mailboxes. This is true of postal workers at every level. The sorting clerks who work night shifts processing millions of pieces of mail, the truck drivers who transport mail between cities, the customer service workers who help people track packages and resolve delivery problems. They are all, in their different ways, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that allows modern society to function. And they are all, to varying degrees, disappearing. Automation replaces sorters. GPS and route optimization software reduces the need for carriers' intimate knowledge of their routes. Self-service kiosks replace counter workers. The Postal Service, like every other industry, is discovering that human labour can often be replaced by technology that's cheaper and more predictable. This is progress, in a sense. Efficiency improves, costs decrease. But something is lost when the human element is removed from these systems. The mail carrier who knew everyone on their route, who noticed when something was wrong, who provided not just mail delivery but a human presence, that person is becoming a rarity. The architecture of post offices themselves tells a story that parallels the broader history of the Postal Service. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, post offices were monuments, grand buildings constructed in the neoclassical style that was thought to convey permanence, authority, and civic virtue. These buildings were often the most impressive structures in their communities. In small towns across America, the post office might be the only stone building, the only structure with columns and carved inscriptions, the only place that looked like it belonged in a great city rather than a rural outpost. This was intentional. The post office represented the federal government's presence and commitment. It was a physical manifestation of the promise that even in remote places, you were part of the larger nation. Inside these buildings, the architecture reinforced social hierarchies and postal procedures. High ceilings created an atmosphere of importance. Marble floors and wooden counters spoke of durability and tradition. The space behind the counter, where postal workers sorted mail and conducted the actual business of the service, was separated from the public space by barriers that emphasized the postal workers' official authority. In larger cities, post offices became grand civic spaces. The James A. Farley Post Office in New York City, completed in 1914, occupies 2 full city blocks. Its facade stretches for nearly 500 feet, lined with Corinthian columns. The inscription across the top, the famous motto adapted from Herodotus, is carved in letters 2 feet tall. Inside, the main hall has ceilings soaring 50 feet high, natural light streaming through arched windows, the space designed to inspire awe. This was architecture as statement. The Postal Service was important, permanent, worthy of the nation's finest craftsmanship and most expensive materials. To enter a post office was to enter a temple of communication, a sacred space devoted to the connection of human beings across distance. But by the mid-20th century, architectural fashion had changed. New post offices were built in the modernist style, functional, efficient, stripped of ornament. These buildings made no pretense of being monuments. They were places of work designed for the efficient processing of mail rather than the inspiration of citizens. This shift reflected a change in how the Postal Service understood itself. It was no longer a grand national project worthy of monumental architecture. It was a utility, like water or electricity, essential but mundane, needing to be efficient rather than impressive. Many of the old grand post offices have been repurposed or demolished. The ones that remain are often listed as historic buildings, preserved more for their architectural merit than for their ongoing postal function. The working post offices of today are more likely to be found in strip malls, in converted storefronts, in utilitarian buildings indistinguishable from the businesses around them. This transformation is not merely aesthetic. It represents a fundamental change in the postal service's place in society. When the post office was a grand building at the centre of town, it was a gathering place, a civic commons. People went there not just to mail letters, but to see their neighbours, to conduct business, to participate in public life. The post office was a node in the social network that held communities together. The modern post office, tucked into a strip mall or relegated to an industrial park, serves no such function. You go there for a specific transaction, to buy stamps, to mail a package, and leave. There is no lingering, no social dimension to the interaction. The postal service has become transactional rather than communal. The language of postal work is rich with terminology that has evolved over centuries, much of it still in use despite the obsolescence of the practices it originally described. Post itself comes from the Latin posita, meaning placed or stationed, referring to the way stations where couriers would be posted to wait for messages. Mail has a stranger etymology. It comes from the old French mail, meaning a bag or wallet, which itself derived from a Germanic root. Originally, mail referred to the bag that carried letters, not the letters themselves. Over time, the meaning shifted until mail meant the contents rather than the container, though we still use the term mail bag as a relic of the original meaning. Postmark is self-explanatory, a mark applied by a post office, but the specific information encoded in postmarks has varied over time and place. Early postmarks were simple stamps indicating the office of origin. Later, they added dates, then times, creating a record of when and where a letter entered the postal system. These postmarks became evidence in legal cases, proof of when contracts were mailed, documentation of correspondence that might be disputed. Philately, the study and collection of stamps, developed its own extensive vocabulary. Terms like perforation, watermark, overprint, and surcharge have specific technical meanings related to stamp production. The hobby of stamp collecting, which reached its peak popularity in the mid-20th century, created a global community of people who studied postal history through its physical artifacts. Stamps themselves are fascinating objects. They are simultaneously art, currency, and legal documents. They must be beautiful enough to be collectible, practical enough to be used, and secure enough to prevent counterfeiting. The images on stamps have always been carefully chosen to represent national identity, commemorate important figures and events, and sometimes to make political statements. During wartime, stamps became propaganda tools. Countries issued stamps celebrating military victories, honouring heroes, depicting enemy leaders in unflattering ways. The Nazis used stamps to promote their ideology. The Soviets used stamps to celebrate socialist achievements. Even democratic nations use stamps to shape public opinion and national narrative. But stamps also democratized art and design. For many people in the 19th and early 20th centuries, postage stamps were the most accessible form of high-quality printing and illustration. The small rectangle of paper, printed in multiple colours with fine detail, brought beauty into everyday life in a way that few other affordable objects could. The decline of stamp collecting parallels the decline of letter writing. As fewer people send physical mail, fewer people handle stamps regularly, and the hobby that once engaged millions has become increasingly niche. Entire generations are growing up without ever buying a stamp, never needing to know the cost of postage or how to properly address an envelope. This seems like a minor cultural loss, a hobby fading, nothing more. But it represents something larger, the dissolution of shared knowledge about how communication works. When everyone wrote letters, everyone understood the basic mechanics of the postal system. You knew that letters took time to arrive, that postage costs varied by weight and distance, that addresses had to be written clearly and completely. In an age of instant digital communication, this knowledge is becoming obsolete. And with it goes an understanding of distance, of time, of the physical reality that still underlies all communication, even when we pretend it doesn't. The postal system has always been vulnerable to forces beyond its control: war, natural disaster, economic collapse. But it has also shown remarkable resilience, an ability to continue functioning even under the most adverse conditions. During the Great Depression, mail volumes declined as people had less money to spend on postage and less business to conduct. Postal revenues fell, but the service continued, employing thousands of workers who might otherwise have been unemployed, maintaining routes even when they were no longer economically justifiable. This was possible because postal services in most countries were government entities, funded through taxation rather than purely through user fees. The postal service was understood to be a public good, something worth maintaining even at a loss because of its social and economic importance. But this model has been increasingly challenged in recent decades. As letter volumes decline and package delivery becomes the core business, postal services face pressure to operate more like private companies, to close unprofitable post offices, to eliminate service to expensive-to-reach areas, to prioritize efficiency over universal service. The tension between the postal service as a public good and the postal service as a business has never been fully resolved. Should rural areas receive the same level of service as cities, even if it costs more to provide? Should every community have a post office, even small ones where the volume doesn't justify the expense? Should postal rates be uniform nationwide, or should they reflect the actual cost of delivery to different areas? Different countries have answered these questions differently. Some have privatized their postal services entirely. Others maintain them as government agencies with explicit universal service obligations. The United States occupies a middle ground. The Postal Service is a government agency but is expected to be financially self-sufficient, receiving no direct taxpayer funding for operations. This arrangement creates constant tension. The Postal Service is required to serve all Americans equally, but must generate enough revenue to cover its costs. When mail volumes decline, when competitors siphon off the most profitable package delivery, when politicians prevent it from adjusting rates or cutting service, the result is an organization perpetually on the edge of crisis. Yet it persists. Through all the challenges, the mail still arrives 6 days a week. Carriers still walk their routes. Sorting facilities still process millions of pieces of mail every night. The system, for all its flaws and stresses, still works. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 revealed just how essential the postal service remains, even in an age of digital communication. When lockdowns closed businesses and kept people at home, package delivery surged to unprecedented levels. People who had never shopped online before suddenly depended on it for everything from groceries to medicine to entertainment. The postal workers who delivered these packages became overnight essential workers, people risking exposure to disease to ensure that society continued to function. They worked without adequate protective equipment in the early days of the pandemic, before the supply chains caught up with demand. They worked despite the very real possibility of infection, of bringing the disease home to their own families, and they were largely invisible in the public narrative. The pandemic generated enormous attention for healthcare workers, justifiably so, and for grocery store workers, delivery drivers, sanitation workers. Postal workers received less recognition, perhaps because their work seemed less directly connected to fighting the disease. But in homes across the country, people waited for the mail carrier with an intensity they hadn't felt in years. The mail brought medication, supplies, contact with the outside world. The mail carrier was often the only person some isolated individuals saw for days at a time. The ritual of mail delivery, the sound of the truck, the opening of the mailbox, the sorting through what had arrived, became one of the few stable routines in a time of disruption and uncertainty. This exposed something that many had forgotten. We still need physical delivery. We still need human beings carrying things from place to place. All the digital communication in the world cannot replace the need for actual objects to move through actual space. Food must be transported. Medicine must be delivered. Goods must travel from warehouses to homes. The postal service, which had seemed almost anachronistic in the early 21st century, a holdover from an earlier age gradually being displaced by newer technologies, revealed itself to be fundamental infrastructure, as essential as roads or electrical grids. There is a philosophy embedded in the postal service, a set of assumptions about human society that we rarely articulate but that shapes how the system operates. The postal service assumes, first, that connection across distance is valuable enough to be worth significant collective investment. It assumes that everyone should have access to communication, regardless of where they live or how much money they have. These are not self-evident truths. They are choices, values that society has collectively decided to prioritize. In a purely market-driven system, there would be no mail delivery to remote areas. The cost would exceed what anyone would be willing to pay. In a purely private system, there would be no universal addressing, no guarantee that a letter would be delivered regardless of the sender's ability to pay. The Postal Service is, in this sense, a statement of values. It says that we believe in connection, in communication, in the idea that distance should not be an insurmountable barrier. It says that we are willing to bear the cost of maintaining this connection for everyone, not just for those who can afford premium services. This philosophical foundation has eroded in recent decades. The rise of private package delivery companies has created a two-tier system where those who can pay more get faster, better service. The reduction in postal funding has led to slower service, longer lines, closed post offices. The assumption that the postal service is a public good worth maintaining has given way to the assumption that it should operate like a business, prioritizing efficiency and profitability over universal access. But the core function remains unchanged. The postal service still connects people across distance. It still delivers to every address in the country. It still operates on the principle that communication is a right, not just a privilege for those who can afford it. Whether this principle will survive the 21st century is an open question. The forces pushing toward privatization and service reduction are strong. The economic model that sustained the postal service for centuries, high-volume letter mail subsidizing universal service, has broken down. What will replace it is unclear. The romance of the postal service, the image of dedicated workers braving any obstacle to deliver the mail, has always contained within it an element of tragedy. The mail must go through, we say, but we rarely ask what is sacrificed to make that happen. The railway mail clerks who died in train crashes, the airmail pilots who flew into mountains, the packet ship crews who drowned in storms, the carriers who collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. These are not abstract historical figures. They were real people with families, dreams, fears. They died doing a job that most people barely noticed, delivering letters that were forgotten almost as soon as they were read. Was their sacrifice worth it? This is not a question with an easy answer. The mail they died carrying was not, for the most part, particularly important. Love letters, business correspondence, newspapers, valuable to the individuals involved, but not to history, not in the grand scheme of things. Yet their sacrifice made possible the system that connected a nation, that allowed people separated by vast distances to remain in contact, that enabled the formation of the social bonds that make civilization possible. Without the Postal Service, without the thousands of anonymous workers who made it function, American society would have been fundamentally different, more fragmented, more isolated, less capable of collective action. Perhaps this is enough. Perhaps the value of connection is so great that the cost measured in individual lives is justified. Or perhaps this is simply what we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless deaths, to find meaning in tragedy. The postal workers of today face different dangers. They are killed in traffic accidents, attacked by dogs, assaulted by people angry about lost mail or delayed packages. They suffer from repetitive stress injuries, from the physical toll of walking miles every day carrying heavy loads. They work in heat that can cause heat stroke, in cold that can cause frostbite, in conditions that would violate workplace safety regulations in almost any other industry. They do this for modest pay and diminishing respect. The job security and middle-class wages that once made postal work attractive have eroded. The pension that postal workers once could rely on is less generous than it was, less certain. The sense that working for the Postal Service was a stable, respectable career has given way to the sense that it is a job of last resort, something you do when better options aren't available. And yet people still do it, still walk the routes, still sort the mail, still drive the trucks through blizzards and heat waves. They do it because someone has to, because the system depends on human labour that cannot yet be fully automated, because for all its flaws, the job still serves a purpose that matters. We now live in an age where communication is instantaneous, frictionless, and nearly limitless. Messages travel across continents in milliseconds. Images, voices, and ideas move faster than thought itself. And yet something essential has thinned in the process. Speed has replaced deliberation. Quantity has replaced care. The letter once demanded patience. It required time not only to arrive, but to be written at all. One had to sit with their thoughts, decide what mattered enough to be preserved in ink, and accept that once sent the words could not be retrieved or revised. A letter carried consequence. It asked the writer to be honest, or at least intentional. Digital communication asks for none of this. It invites reaction rather than reflection. Words are typed quickly, sent impulsively, forgotten instantly. Communication has become abundant, but meaning has become scarce. This is not nostalgia for inconvenience. It is an observation about human psychology. When effort disappears entirely, value often follows. The Postal Service understood something fundamental about human connection long before anyone articulated it. That distance gives weight to communication. That waiting deepens attachment. That effort transforms information into meaning. The system was slow not because it was inefficient, but because physical reality demanded slowness. And in that slowness, relationships were shaped. The disappearance of letters did not happen because they failed. It happened because society chose speed over depth. Yet the need that created the Postal Service has not vanished. Humans still long to be seen, remembered and connected. The medium has changed, but the desire remains unchanged. What has shifted is our tolerance for silence, for absence, for uncertainty. We no longer wait. And because we do not wait, we rarely wonder. The Postal Service once embodied a quiet faith in the future. You mailed a letter believing it would arrive, believing the system would hold, believing that someone you could not see would receive what you sent. This faith was rarely articulated, but it was practiced daily by millions of people. It created a subtle trust in institutions, in strangers, in continuity itself. That trust has eroded. Today's communication systems are powerful but fragile. They depend on electricity, servers, corporations, algorithms, and incentives that few users understand and fewer control. Messages feel permanent until they vanish. Platforms feel stable until they collapse. The infrastructure is invisible, centralized, and opaque. The Postal Service, by contrast, was stubbornly physical. Roads, trains, planes, buildings, people. You could see it working. You could point to it. You could stand inside it. When it failed, you knew why. When it succeeded, you took it for granted. There is something profoundly human about systems that reveal their labour. This visibility mattered not just culturally, but politically. A society that sees the work required to maintain connection is more likely to value it. When labour disappears behind screens, it becomes easy to forget that systems are built and sustained by people who can be exhausted, injured, or discarded. Postal workers were never abstractions. They had names, routes, routines. They aged alongside the neighbourhoods they served. Their presence created continuity in a world that was otherwise in constant motion. As automation advances and efficiency becomes the dominant metric, this kind of continuity becomes harder to justify. Human presence is expensive. Attention is inefficient. Care does not scale well. And yet, these are precisely the qualities that once gave the Postal Service its social power. The future of the Postal Service is uncertain, but the question it raises is larger than any single institution. What do we lose when we design systems solely for speed and profit? What disappears when we treat connection as a commodity rather than a responsibility? What happens to a society when the spaces that once belonged to everyone become purely transactional? The post office was never just a place to send mail. It was a symbol of shared obligation. It said no matter where you live, no matter who you are reachable, you are included, you matter enough for the system to come to you. This idea is fragile. It survives only as long as a society chooses to protect it. The story of the Postal Service is, ultimately, a story about values, about what we are willing to pay for collectively, about whether connection is a luxury or a right, about whether efficiency is the highest good or merely one good among many. Civilizations are not defined only by what they build, but by what they maintain, the roads they keep open, the institutions they refuse to abandon, the invisible labour they continue to honour even when it no longer seems profitable. The mail still arrives. That fact alone is extraordinary. In an era of rapid change, political division and digital abstraction, the continued existence of the Postal Service is a quiet act of resistance against fragmentation. It insists that some connections should remain universal, that some services should not be optimized out of existence, that some systems exist not to generate profit, but to hold society together. Perhaps one day letters will vanish entirely. Perhaps the post office will become a relic, preserved in museums and memory, but the principle it embodied will remain unresolved, whether human connection can survive without patience, without effort, without shared infrastructure. The Postal Service did not merely move mail, it moved trust, it carried attention across distance, it transformed isolation into relationship. And in doing so, it helped build the social fabric that modern life now quietly depends upon. If that fabric unravels, it will not be because we lack technology, it will be because we forgot why connection mattered in the first place.